August 1964, US President Lyndon B. Johnson has inherited an ongoing crisis in the Southeast Asian nation of Vietnam from his predecessor, John F. Kennedy. The crisis involves the spreading of communism from North Vietnam into the South and potentially beyond, threatening the US position in the region against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. At first, he adopts the policy of training and equipping the South Vietnamese Army to fight the war themselves. But when a US warship is attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, he and his government feel the fight now requires more direct involvement. The US military complex was unlike any other on the planet in 1964. Large and highly sophisticated, it was believed that it could achieve any objective put before it. And yet in Vietnam, this technical marvel was forced to get down in the mud to fight its enemy. This led US leaders to look back at improving the most valuable piece of equipment at their disposal: the US soldier. Science offered the possibility of giving the US trooper greater endurance, strength, aggression against their enemy, and protection from the stresses of war. This was the era of the drug-enhanced super soldier, but as history would prove, it would come at a cost. This is the story of how the Vietnam War would become the pharmacological war. Welcome to Wars of the World. Throughout the history of warfare, military commanders have always sought to better their own troops in a variety of ways, in the hope of securing victory. Before the creation of world nations, when mankind lived in small, often nomadic tribes, conflict with other groups often saw the tribe with the highest number of warriors emerge as the victor, bludgeoning or spearing their enemies to death in an orgy of unorganized violence. However, the risks of other tribes forming alliances meant that even the biggest single tribe could find itself outnumbered, and this led to probably the most fundamental development in the history of creating the perfect soldier: discipline. It's easy to forget just how much of an impact instilling discipline in an armed force has had on warfare, as it has allowed commanders to better dictate military campaigns. The instilling of discipline and a chain of command has also led to another major innovation: that of standardizing training. Again, this seems obvious to modern eyes, but standard training improves an army's efficiency since the whole force knows what's expected of them when the battle commences. To achieve the necessary levels of discipline and training for battle, soldiers had to be mentally conditioned for the task at hand, either through indoctrination, such as religious instruction, or through threats made against them or their loved ones, if they didn't commit to the cause they were expected to fight for. It's not a coincidence, therefore, that the first of history's super soldiers, such as the Roman army, conditioned their troops for war and instilled in them the third important condition: a desire to win. The conditioning of troops, both physically and mentally, has become a staple of armies up to the present day, with troops often being seen more as property of the state than people, thus making it more acceptable to change them for a desired purpose. Fast forwarding to the early 1960s and the United States' growing concern of the unfolding situation in Southeast Asia, let's consider how these three factors: discipline, training, and a will to win apply to US troops of the time. In 1964, without question, the US Armed Forces was one of the best trained and most highly disciplined in the world, possessing superior weapons, technology, and a wealth of combat experience from both Korea and World War II. This was why, on paper, observers were confident of a US victory in Vietnam in 1964, following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which a US Navy warship was attacked by the North Vietnamese Navy, kickstarting direct US military participation in the conflict. However, when it comes to the third factor, a desire to win, things become a little more unclear. For the US military and political leadership, the reason there was a need to intervene was obvious. If South Vietnam fell to the communist bloc, no doubt neighboring Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand would go to affording China and the Soviet Union bases, which would allow for the ships and aircraft to attack US interests in the Pacific if a World War III ever broke out. Therefore, in Washington, the desire to win was strong, but of course, they weren't doing the fighting. The ordinary people on the street who made up the bulk of the US armed forces were often not as clear about the threat in Vietnam. For them, what happened across the Pacific Ocean didn't concern them in their everyday lives, and while most Americans recognized the threats from the communist world, they had also been indoctrinated with US propaganda, instilling that the US military was so strong that they could never truly be defeated at home, even in a nuclear war. Thus, the motivation for going to war in another country, for a people and culture who were distinctly foreign to them, was low, especially amongst conscripts, brought in to shore up US numbers in Vietnam, leading to noticeable declines in morale. However, even amongst the hardcore elements of its military who believed in the fight, there was growing disillusionment with the way the war was being conducted. While their enemy had evolved their entire way of life to live and fight in the jungles, the Americans often struggled to meet both the physical and psychological requirements of the type of combat, leading to a degradation of performance. Therefore, the US leadership began to look at ways of increasing the endurance of their men and improve their well-being through the use of drugs. They believed that such performance-enhancing pharmaceuticals could revolutionize the molding of civilians into soldiers, modifying their behaviors to make them want to fight, and maybe even create the first generation of super soldiers. Of course, knowing that a war was a physically demanding undertaking was hardly a revelation. Napoleon Bonaparte himself once lamented, quote, "The first virtue in a soldier is endurance of fatigue. Courage is only the second virtue." End quote. Vietnam was unlike many of the conflicts the US Army had tailored itself towards. Whereas in World War II and the Korean War, where much of the US Army leadership in Vietnam had cut their teeth, fighting in Southeast Asia lacked an established front line. It was an area war, where certain regions were rife with enemy activity, while others were not, with very little rhyme or reason as to why one area or another was the way it was. Adding to this was the inhospitable terrain and dense jungle, which made simply marching a difficult prospect, let alone using vehicles, armored or otherwise. Couple this with the plethora of equipment the US soldier was issued to carry, certainly being a blessing while in combat, but also a curse at almost any other time in this hot and humid atmosphere. It quickly became clear that Vietnam was a conflict which could break even the toughest Western body. Even with helicopters allowing troops to skip over large portions of terrain, the problems remained once they were on the ground, and helicopters were often limited by where they could land, and would often fly over concealed enemy positions without even realizing it. Thus, the US troops were forced to get down in the jungle to look for their enemy, and hopefully to fight them with enough strength to put up a good showing. Physical training was of course of the highest priority in an effort to force the men's bodies to adjust to the demands of Vietnam. But nature could only go so far. Since the end of World War II, research had been carried out by several doctors in conjunction with the US Army on so-called PEP pills, which were intended to medically stave off the effects of exhaustion. In Vietnam, this research had led to the issuing of dextroamphetamines to troops to keep them alert and to give them greater endurance. This drug is still used today to treat the sleeping disorder narcolepsy and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, but in Vietnam, it was intended for performance enhancement and worked by stimulating the central nervous system. According to US Army guidelines, for a 48-hour patrol, US service personnel could be prescribed 20 milligrams, which should have produced notable improvements compared to the same period and activity without the drug. However, testimony from troops in the field revealed that very little attention was ever given to the exact dosage being issued, with one soldier stating that they were being handed out like candies. It was actually the US Navy that was discovered later to be the biggest user of the drug, as sailors often found it hard to focus on their duty aboard ships and patrol craft when very little was happening, and consequently there was very little natural stimulus to keep them awake. In 1971, a report by the House Select Committee on Crime revealed that between 1966 and 1969 alone, members of the armed forces had been issued 225 million tablets of stimulants, mostly dextroamphetamine, to improve their performance in the field. On average, it was discovered that each serving member of the Navy would have consumed 21.1 pills annually, followed by the US Air Force consuming 17.5, while the US Army took 13.8. From the perspective of the military leadership, the pills had a bonus to them in the form of a noticeable increase in aggression. Elton Manzioni was a member of a long-range reconnaissance platoon, or LRP, during the war, and explained how the pills, quote, gave you a sense of bravado as well as keeping you awake. Every sight and sound was heightened. You were wired into it all, and at times you felt really invulnerable. End quote. As if all of this weren't enough, the dextroamphetamine tablets were often backed up with regular steroid injections. But dextroamphetamines were hardly a wonder drug, and came with a host of problems which would emerge over time amongst those who took them regularly. If used incorrectly, there was the risk of the drug affecting the heart and the circulation system, leading to chest pain, trouble breathing, numbness, cold feeling, or pale appearance of fingers or toes. These effects, even if treated at the time, could still lead to heart problems later in the life of the user. Additionally, the feeling of being wired into the environment around the taker, as outlined by Manzioni, can overwhelm the brain, which may struggle to process the information it's receiving. This can lead to bouts of either mania or psychosis, seeing or hearing things which are not real, uncontrollable aggression, paranoia, and unnecessary risk-taking. In short, their use can result in a loss of discipline within a soldier, which can affect others, damaging unit cohesion, or even endangering the team. Taking dextroamphetamines was considered voluntary, but such was the accepting culture amongst military units at the time, particularly with regards to taking pills which appeared to help cope with the demands of service in Vietnam, that few who were offered it ever turned it down. There was also pressure from further up the chain of command to take the tablets for fear that an overly exhausted soldier who had not taken the tablets might hold back the others who had, with these troops often being offered the tablets when they felt their stamina failing and their mental resistance to taking the drugs was at its weakest. Some research carried out regarding drug use amongst service personnel suggested that around 3.2% of US troops were regular users of amphetamine drugs prior to deployment to Vietnam. By the end of the standard one-year tour of duty, that number would have risen to 5.2%, which in real terms meant that in 1967, 19,000 US service personnel were regularly taking stimulants to improve their performance in the field. Such regular use of course had one major drawback, and that was that men's own body chemistry would become used to receiving the drugs. In other words, they would become addicted. This presented a problem when the drug wasn't needed operationally, and therefore was not issued. But with the body now relying on it, there were naturally consequences, both physically and psychologically. Thousands became addicted to receiving these stimulants due to the general ignorance of the fact that you can't just take such pills without them having a long-term impact. From the military leadership perspective, this was just another factor they had to deal with when it came to the psychological well-being of their troops. The morale of troops has always been long recognized as vital to achieving a successful campaign. For if morale was allowed to sink too low, troops could be gripped by a sense of defeatism, leading to a loss of discipline, or even a lack of effort in battle, leading to a degree of collective suicide. It wasn't until the dawn of the 20th century and the birth of modern psychiatry that military medicine truly began to appreciate the role which psychology played in warfare. Just like how physical diseases sapped through the strength of army units, so too did mental illness. And by the mid-1950s, there were great efforts to alleviate the mental suffering of troops in combat. Viewing it almost like a physical injury, the US Army again saw medication as the answer. In Vietnam, one of the more widely used drugs to help troops cope with the mental stress of combat was chlorpromazine, manufactured by GlaxoSmithKline under the brand name Thorazine. Thorazine is a phenothiazine antipsychotic medication, which means it works by blocking messages sent using the substance dopamine within the brain. In peacetime, it was used to treat psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia or manic depression and severe behavioral problems in children. But in Vietnam, it was widely used to treat war anxiety, as was the drug Valium. This was not something that was kept quiet, but was widely reported, and GlaxoSmithKline openly promoted its business within the US States military to boost its prestige. Research into the effectiveness of these drugs seemed to support their use. Military psychiatrists at the time reported that whereas the rate of mental breakdowns among American soldiers was in the region of 10% during the Second World War and around 4% in the Korean War, in Vietnam it fell to just 1%, equating to 12 cases per 1,000 troops. On paper then, the practice of medicating troops to fend off mental fatigue or anxiety from combat appeared to be working. But very quickly, critics began to highlight just how short-sighted these figures were. Civilian psychiatrists monitoring their military counterparts' work were quick to point out that the drugs often impaired physical ability, but more importantly, they were not addressing the cause of the stress. The use of such drugs in the civilian world being to help the patient cope while they received long-term treatment. They pointed out that the drugs taken without proper psychotherapy only suppresses the problems which they were intended to tackle, which remained deeply embedded in the psyche, which of course presents the risk of them exploding to the surface years later as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. According to research conducted by author Łukasz Kamienski for his book Shooting Up, A Short History of Drugs and War, the myth amongst military leaders that antipsychotic drugs alone were negating the impact of the trauma of war led to a dramatic surge in PTSD cases after the conflict had ended. Despite being taken out of the war zone and returning to their everyday lives in the US, they were ill-prepared to deal with the sudden explosion of emotions and unfiltered memories that bombarded them almost daily. No longer suppressing this trauma with prescribed medication, thousands of veterans turned to recreational drugs as a substitute. Back in Vietnam, recreational drug use famously soared amongst US troops during the conflict, with the image of troops smoking marijuana being as embedded into the public perception of the war as scenes of Huey helicopters filling the skies, carrying troops clutching their M16 rifles. Yet while politicians in the United States had declared a war on drugs, military commanders in Vietnam were actually tolerating its use, seeing it as just another coping mechanism for the men, such as the prescribed medications and the traditional soldiering activity of alcohol consumption. Other officers more pessimistically reported that the environment amongst troops for using drugs, either from official sources or as a result of growing drug use, courtesy of the counterculture generation of 1960s America, meant that it was impossible for them to try and stop it, and so they let their soldiers self-medicate when off duty. However, the Army's hand was forced in January 1968 when a Vietnam veteran, John Steinbeck, wrote an expose for the Washingtonian magazine, revealing the extent of drug use amongst service personnel in Vietnam. In response, the US Army clamped down on drug users, at one point arresting as many as 1,000 troops a week on drug charges. Nevertheless, recreational drug use continued to be a widespread problem. According to another report in 1971 by the Department of Defense, as many as 51% of the US Armed Forces had smoked marijuana, and 31% had used psychedelics, such as LSD, mescaline, or psilocybin mushrooms. Added to this was an additional 28% who had admitted to taking harder drugs, such as cocaine or heroin, the availability of which had soared thanks to the civil war in Cambodia, which was being funded by the drug trade. Such figures horrified the people at home, and the US press were awash with the claims that hordes of drug-addicted GIs were returning home to spread crime and violence. In response, the US government implemented the rather crudely named Operation Golden Flow, beginning in 1971, which required all returning servicemen to submit to a urinalysis before flying home. Those who failed were required to stay in Vietnam for detoxification, giving a clear incentive for troops to stop using them the closer they got to the end of their tours. However, whether issued by their commanding officers to improve stamina, or purchased on Vietnam's black market to get some kind of release from the horrors of war, drug culture had taken hold in the US troops, and coming off them would prove extremely difficult. Łukasz Kamienski argues in his book that the effects of drug withdrawal actually led to a number of atrocities committed against the Vietnamese people by US troops during the war. He revealed a testimony from one soldier who admitted that after using dextroamphetamines to improve his effectiveness during an extended combat patrol, that in the days after the patrol was completed and he was no longer receiving the pep pills, he became so agitated that at one point he found himself in the position where he was actually considering shooting a group of Vietnamese children. While he was able to restrain himself, the question has to be asked: how many weren't so controlled under similar circumstances, and what potentially horrific actions did they take? After the war had ended, many troops either underwent difficult rehabilitation programs, or in some of the sadder cases, fell deeper into drug use. But while the Vietnam War highlighted some of the problems of using drugs to improve a soldier's performance, it by no means settled the argument. Western culture continues to push for medication to aid all quality of life, with this also extending into the military world. Military commanders and psychiatrists continue to argue for decades after the war and into following conflicts over what use medications could have for troops. Those who support the practice argue that modern medication, combined with an increased appreciation of psychiatric conditions and treatment surrounding their use, mean that it is now far safer to use medication to help soldiers through the ordeal of war. However, the pressures of meeting the requirements for military operations, particularly in multiple theaters, such as during the War on Terror in the early 2000s, has led to a relaxing of rules regarding medications. Data from the US Department of Defense in 2008 showed that as of September 2007, prescriptions for narcotics for active duty troops serving in Iraq had risen to over 50,000 pills a month, compared to 33,000 a month in October 2003, in an effort to keep troops from being medically evacuated back to the US with some kind of war fatigue or PTSD. An NBC report by Melody Peterson in 2009 stated that many of the antidepressants issued to these troops, equipped with the latest weaponry and placed in high-stress environments, were so potent that the Federal Aviation Authority barred civil airline pilots from flying while taking them. Yet troops were allowed to make life-and-death decisions while under their influence. Today, the idea of drug-enhanced super soldiers who can traverse great distances with ease and not be harmed psychologically by the immorality of war appears to be slipping into the realms of a nightmarish science fiction, as technology is increasingly being used to aid soldiers instead. However, the question of how much medical intervention is safe to be used by soldiers continues to be a topic of intense debate, particularly as issues concerning veteran welfare has become something of a political football, kicked between opposing parties vying for office in the West. And one way or another, it's one that doesn't look like it's going to be going away anytime soon.